Hello guys, and welcome. We are here for another set review. I don't do these particularly often, and that's because I like to focus specifically on Modern as a format. I don't really play any other formats, and so when I don't think a set is particularly impactful for Modern, I don't tend to make a video like this. However, there were a few interesting cards in Kamigawa Neon Dynasty that I thought could have an impact, and so today we are going over all the cards from Kamigawa Neon Dynasty, except it's only the cards that are actually good and that will actually have some sort of impact on Modern. In my opinion, of course, this is all speculation, and I'm likely to miss possible staples or or overvalue certain cards. I famously undervalued Dragon's Rage Channeler in the Modern Horizons 2 set review, so anyways, that one went over pretty popular in general, that video, and so I decided I'd do another version of it, a little more high effort, so we got the PowerPoint going on today. And yeah, let's just jump right into it. To start off, I have a couple of honorable mentions. There were a few more on my list, but these are the 5 that I condensed it down to, and these are cards like Banishing Slash that I think are powerful and strong, but maybe don't have quite a home or not quite worth mentioning. Banishing Slash in particular is a sorcery that can destroy an artifact, enchantment, or a tapped creature, and then the other part about if you control an artifact or enchantment, and enchantment, you make a 2/2. I feel like that won't come up very often in Modern, but it is possible. Mainly, this is a 2-mana disenchant that also happens to hit tapped creatures. I made this one an honorable mention because of the fact that not only will this hit things like Urza's Saga or whatever artifacts or enchantments your opponent has, Blood Moons and Snaring Bridges, whatever, it can also hit a Death Shadow that's attacked or something along those lines. You know, a tapped DRC, for example, and having that additional flexibility, I think, makes this card a very interesting one. Not sure about Modern staple quality, but here it is as an honorable mention nonetheless. Secondly, another honorable mention is actually a rare from the set in March of a Wretched Sorrow from the Pitch Cycle. This is the black one that does X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life, and of course, you can pitch a black card, or any number of black cards from your hand to make it cost 2 less. The reason why I have this one as an honorable mention is the ability at 1 mana at instant speed to be able to kill something like a Ragavan or an early creature or whatever, and to gain some life to go along with that is quite strong, actually, and I think that in general could make this card somewhat playable, but the steep cost of getting rid of an additional card just to deal 2 damage to something and you gain 2 life, I mean, it does scale later into the game, and so I think it has potential, but I don't think it's the strongest of the cycle by far. And anyways, I do think this one has potential, but again, we see it here on the honorable mentions list. Another honorable mention that I wanted to put on here, just because I really like the card, is Greater Tanuki. I apologize for the pronunciation, as I am not that well versed in this culture, so please feel free to correct me on my pronunciation in the comments below. But regardless, we got a 6-mana enchantment creature, 6/5 with trample, and this is the first of many that we're going to see throughout this video with the channel ability. In this particular case, it's 3 mana to discard it and search for a basic land and put it on the battlefield tapped. And the reason why I have this one as an honorable mention, as we'll see in the future when we see other cards, is that these channelers that cost less to use the channel ability than they actually cost as a card are going to come up quite powerful when we're looking at decks like Cascade decks or Living End decks. So like, for example, anything that's playing Crashing Footfalls or Living End, or anything that's just trying to do Cascade shenanigans, will now have access to several cards that have these channel abilities that we can discard to get an additional effect. However, the reason I put this one as an honorable mention is because I'm not sure that any of those Cascade decks are really interested in a 3-mana rampant growth effect, as 3 mana is already enough to be casting your Violent Outbursts and your Shardless Agents and your Ardent Pleas and what have you. So ramping up to a 4th land drop doesn't seem that relevant to me. It's actually kind of an interesting one for like ramp style strategies where you want additional threats, but you also want to insulate yourself against Blood Moon, so you could like channel for a basic land or something like that. However, I get the feeling that this card doesn't really have a home, but it's a very awesome art, and it's also another powerful effect. That channel ability, I think, will be very powerful, especially on some of the cards we'll see in the future. So, again, an honorable mention in this case. We also have this 3-mana 4/3 Greasefang Okiba Boss, the legendary creature, a rat pilot, of course, as many rats are present in this set. And at the beginning of combat, on your turn, return a vehicle from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, and then return it to hand at the beginning of the next end step. Of course, some people are going to try to pair this with really awesome, powerful vehicles like Parhelion 2, I know is one that is kind of a meme, but also kind of serious, and I put it as an honorable mention because in Modern specifically, I feel like this could spawn kind of a silly archetype of decks, but I don't necessarily expect it to be super competitive, and even if it is, it's going to be a very specific application, so it's not like this card is going to be super expensive or anything, in my opinion, so it does get a spot in the honorable mentions, however, for the fun that is returning vehicles to the battlefield. And speaking of vehicles, our last honorable mention here is High Speed Hoverbike, a 2-mana flash artifact that enters the battlefield and taps up to one target creature, and then it can crew for 1 and just make itself a 2/2 flash flying. We've seen from previous cards like Smuggling Copter that crew 1 is a very low cost. There are very many random tokens or whatever that can crew up a nice flying vehicle to get over in the air, which is not at all irrelevant. The fact that it has flying. And then, of course, it has that ETB tap ability. We see some cards with tap abilities being pretty decent in Modern. Anything from, Pestermite and Deceiver Exarch tapping a creature before combat back in the days when Twin was legal. But also, currently, Merfolk decks play the card Merfolk Trickster, which has a really nice disruptive tap and lose all abilities line of text on it. And that almost by itself makes the card playable, other than the fact that it's a Merfolk. So I wanted to put this as an honorable mention because I don't really see a deck that is capable of abusing this card. I think it's an interesting design and possibly good, but probably not up to snuff for the Modern format, but I thought it was an interesting one to note. So I'm going to just jump right in with the cards that I think will be absolute Modern format staples. You will see these cards, and they will most likely be powerful to stand up to what the rest of the format is doing, and I do have 13 of these to mention. The first one is, of course, Lion Sash. If any of you are familiar with Modern, especially the card Stoneforge Mystic, you'll know where this card will appear. It's a 2-mana 1/1 that gets +1 for each +1/+1 counter on the Sash. And then, of course, you can pay 1 to exile a card from a graveyard. If it's a permanent, it gets a +1/+1 counter. So, of course, on the surface, this is a 2-mana 1/1 that you can kind of scavenging use permanents out of the graveyard to make it a little bit bigger. And then, of course, you can reconfigure it onto another creature. So, anyways, just having a tourable way to hate on opponents' graveyards is quite nice, especially in Reanimator-type matchups, but it's also good against the Luris decks and that kind of thing, so this is definitely a nice utility card for those Stoneforge Mystic decks. Admittedly, I am including this one mainly because of the hype that's around it, and so many people are going to be playing with it with Stoneforge that I've already seen on Twitter and other places. I don't necessarily think this card is as powerful as everybody says it is, however, I do think that it will definitely see play, and it makes sense as a one-of, so that is our first format staple. And the second one that I want to put here is a format staple in the sense that I think any deck that is interested in this type of ability, any deck that would play the 4-mana ninja that draws a card, I forget what it's called, Ninja of the Deep Hours, I believe, is interested in this card. It's a Moon Circuit Hacker for 2 mana with a Ninjutsu 1. Let's say switch places for 1 mana with a card that is unblocked when you attack. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, if it's the first time that Moon Circuit Hacker has entered the battlefield, you just draw a card. Otherwise, you draw and discard. And again, a Ninjutsu 1 cost, or a Ninjutsu cost for 1 blue is extremely low, especially when you're going to be playing this in a deck with low-to-the-ground flyers, like 1-mana, flyers that have, like, an ETB draw card, or scry ability, things like that. Typically, decks that have played this style of effect in Modern before were already interested in playing ninjutsu cards like Ninja of the Deep Hours, and this seems very similar, so I included it on the list. It's only a format staple in the sense that the decks that are interested in this effect, I think, will most definitely be playing some number of this card. I don't think it's going to be everywhere, but in the decks that will play it, I think it'll be a staple for those decks. Now, on the other hand, Moonsnare Prototype is a card that I believe will be a more general Modern format staple. It's a 1-mana artifact that you can tap it and an untapped artifact or creature you control to make a colorless, and then it also has a channel ability where you can discard it and put a permanent on top or bottom of its owner's library. And the reason I put this one here is not only is it a 1-mana artifact, which has traditionally been quite a upside in Modern, just the fact that it's a 1-costing artifact. We see this in cards like Esper Sentinel, for example, but also the fact that this is essentially Springleaf Drums number 5 through 6 in the affinity decks that would want that type of effect. Springleaf Drum is definitely one of the most powerful cards in those affinity decks, and Moonsnare Prototype definitely fits the bill, although it does only tap for colorless. And of course, the fact that you can channel it for an additional ability if you happen to draw multiples or find a way to bounce it to your hand or something to reuse it. I don't think that second will come up. a whole lot, but just having the additional utility is nice. But mostly, I think this card is just playable as another copy of Springleaf Drum, and I think those decks are interested in that type of effect. Speaking of artifact decks, another format staple that I think will just be definitely played in various types of blue artifact strategies is Tezzeret, Betrayer of Flesh. It's a 4-mana walker that has a static ability that says the first activated ability of an artifact you control, or that you activate each turn, costs 2 less to activate. So it makes your first artifact activation 2 less in order to activate that artifact. I have not done a whole lot of research into what types of artifacts you'd want to activate for 2 less. The first one that comes to mind offhand is Oblivion Stone, which probably doesn't work very well with Tezzeret, but regardless, being able to have this static effect can be potentially quite nice. And then, of course, the power of this card, in my opinion, comes from the plus and minus abilities. +1 to Thirst for Knowledge, draw 2 cards, discard 2 cards unless you discard an artifact card, so it's almost Thirst for Knowledge. 1 less card, but still very powerful nonetheless. And a -2 to animate a artifact into a vehicle with a base power toughness 4 and 4. And of course, this is not until end of turn, so it will just persist as a 4/4 throughout the rest of the game, pretty much. And this also can target normal artifact creatures as well to make them base power 4 and 4. So like you hit a Memnite and it becomes a 4/4, for example. And then it has an emblem which says whenever an artifact you control becomes tapped, draw a card. I mean, if you pair this with the 4-mana Urza card, you can literally just tap your artifacts for mana and just draw a bunch of cards. So obviously, I think that the emblem on this one is gonna be game winning when you do get to emblem the Tezzeret. But honestly, I never evaluate a Planeswalker based off of its ultimate. So I think just the card advantage and the ability to make a blocker/threat and the minus ability, those two things, disregarding the very first line of text, the stack ability, I think those are very powerful already. And I definitely think that this card will see play in those artifact decks. Format staple number 5, and of course these are all in the order of the cards from the set. So like all these are organized from the lowest number out of 302 to the highest number of 302. This next one is Hidetsugu. Again, I'm going to butcher these pronunciations. Hidetsugu Consumes All, a 3-mana black-red saga. It has 3 chapter abilities. The first one to destroy each non-land permanent with a value of 1 or less. So a little bit of a pseudo board wipe there. Sort of an engineered explosives effect, kind of, except it also hits all the zeros as well, so quite good there. Second ability to exile all graveyards, which can be quite relevant in a format like we have now, where all of the Ragavan and Murktide Regent decks are trying to fill up their graveyards pretty quickly. This hates on those after a turn. And then, of course, it has the ability to exile and return as a 3/3. Honestly, I think even just the first ability of this, if it was just a 3-mana sorcery that said destroy each non-land permanent with a value of 1 or less, I still think that that card might be good enough to see play. The additional fact that this happens to exile graveyards and eventually becomes a threat on its own, I think makes this card definitely worth consideration, so I put it on the list. And then we have Jukai Naturalist, a 2-mana, 2/2 enchantment creature, lifelink, and it makes enchantment spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. I definitely think that the enchantment decks that exist already in Modern are going to want to play this effect to make their various high-costing enchantments a little cheaper, be able to turbo out those Enchantress effects, the draw card, instead of having to pay their 3 mana for Solitary Confinement and for, Enchantress's Presence or whatever those enchantments are called. I think that being able to cost reduce those is going to be quite effective in a deck that already is trying to ramp out a bunch of enchantments as fast as possible, and it is a lifelinker, which is not irrelevant. Silverfur Master, a blue-black 2/2 rat ninja, is on this list almost specifically for the very last ability on the card. Other ninja and rogue creatures you control get +1/+1. Rogues is already a deck that has seen some fringe rogue play in Modern, and getting another Lord is not a small thing for that deck. It can ninjutsu in to surprise give your team an additional +1/+1 in a deck that is playing a lot of rogues. And the ability to reduce ninjutsu costs could be relevant if there are rogues with ninjutsu, which I admit I haven't really looked at. But I think just the fact that this is a ninja/rogue Lord makes this card good enough for 2 mana. We see the 2-mana Merfolk Lords doing a similar job in Modern and being playable, although, of course, they grant a pseudo-unblockable. But regardless, I think that just because of the fact that this is a card that will buff all your rogues, I think that the rogues deck could be interested in playing this, so I included it. Iron Apprentice is an interesting one. It's a 1-mana 0/0 that enters with a counter, and when it dies, you can transfer those counters to target creature you control. This is very, very similar to Arcbound Worker, which is already a 1-mana effectively 1/1 modular creature. It does something very similar, except that can only transfer to artifact creatures, whereas this one can transfer to any creature. And for that reason, I think that Iron Apprentice could see play. I suppose that the fact that it doesn't exactly say modular is a little worse with the card Zabaz, the Glimmer Wasp, but I'm not sure if that's super relevant. You'll have to ask the Hardened Scales players, but just offhand, this card looks very strong for those purposes. Finally, we get to the format staple that is probably the highest, most well-known buzz-about card that we've seen so far, Bossejo Who Endures, legendary land that taps for a green and does not intertap, then it has the channel ability to destroy an artifact, enchantment, or non-basic land that an opponent controls, and they get to replace it with any land that has a basic land type. So that could be a shock land, or it could be a basic land. And of course, the channel ability here being 1 and a green, and possibly just a green if you have a legendary creature, is quite nice. So you can channel this one to deal with your opponent's Tron land, or their Blood Moons, or their Urza Sagas, or their Ensnaring Bridges, or whatever. There's a ton of relevant hits for this card, and any deck that wants to have access to a repeatable way to blow up your opponent's non-basic lands, or deal with otherwise difficult to deal with permanents, and a deck like Amulet, for example, hitting those Ensnaring Bridges and Blood Moons, quite effective. So I think that Bossejo will definitely see play in Modern, and possibly even be a format staple. And again, we come to another one of these channel lands. This is the white one. Again, white land that enters untapped. It is legendary, and it can be cycled to do 4 damage to an attacking or blocking creature. I don't see a whole lot of talk about this card, but I think that it's quite strong. I think any deck that is playing white might be interested in this effect, especially decks that are either in the Death and Taxes category, where you want additional lands that are flood insurance and can help you deal with your opponent's board state. I think that Eiganju is great for that, but I also think that the blue-white control decks might potentially play a copy or two of this. Probably just a copy, I would assume, maybe just one, but we'll see how that pans out. Regardless, having a land that is in itself a damage-based removal spell, this will hit your Dash Ragavans, it'll hit your 3/3 DRCs, it'll hit, young Death Shadows, ones that have not grown to their full potential just yet, it'll hit Dryads that have attacked, it'll hit various things in the format. 4 damage is a lot of damage, even if it's for 3 mana cost. Obviously, I think if this were 2 mana, it would be a lot better, but regardless, I do think that this card may see some play, especially in those Death and Taxes style decks or control decks. And, of course, yet another legendary channel land here. Like I said, we're going to be seeing channel a lot on this list. We see the blue one. This one has the channel ability to return an artifact, creature, or enchantment, or planeswalker to its owner's hand. So you can use this if you have an additional land to just bounce your opponent's problematic permanent and then be able to counter it on the way back down. I think that this is probably... It's not the weakest, but I think this is the second weakest of the cycle of legendary lands. In fact, not all of them are here under the format staple category. I think that Otawara is nice. I don't think that it's better than various other blue utility lands that we already have. In particular, I think Castle Vantress is probably still better than this card, but some people have been talking about potentially playing 1 or 2 of these, and we'll see if it sticks or not. But because other people seem to be convinced, I've included it here for your benefit. The number 12 here out of 13, so the next one is going to be our last format staple, Secluded Courtyard, a land that lets you choose a creature type and taps for a mana of any color in order to cast a creature spell of that type, or to activate the ability of a creature of that type, or it can just tap for a colorless. I particularly think this one is going to be extremely impactful in humans, where being able to activate your Outland Liberator, for example, or various other humans with activation costs, while still being able to fix your mana for any color for your human spells, and being able to tap for a colorless in addition if you're casting something like an Aether Vial on turn 1 or whatever. Very, very important. Possibly replacing Ancient Ziggurat, perhaps, in those humans lists. That would make sense to me. But in general, you will definitely see this land, because it's basically a strict upgrade to Unclaimed Territory. So any deck that was previously playing Territory will now play Secluded Courtyard instead. That is my prediction, and you'll see a lot of this card for that reason. And then the final format staple that I've identified here is the red of the channel lands. This one creates 2 tokens that have haste. They're colorless spirit tokens, and the main reason I put this one on the list is because there are many decks in Modern that are currently abusing the card Indomitable Creativity, and just having an instant speed way on a land that is otherwise already usable in the deck to cast your red spells in order to create these tokens that you can then untap and creativity into some big dumb creature. Very good. These decks were previously playing, I believe the card was... I don't remember what it's called at the moment. It's the one that makes a 1/1. I believe it's a dwarf when it comes into play. It requires a bunch of mountains. You know the card I'm talking about. Just look up a creativity list and you'll find it. I think that this card will be potentially good in those creativity decks, so I expect to see it, at least for a short while people are experimenting to see if this card is playable in those decks or not. But you will most definitely see this, and I definitely think it has what it takes to go the extra mile and become a format staple for those decks. So now we come to the next section, which is cards that I think are very good and definitely playable in Modern. Possibly staples, maybe they don't have a home, we'll see. And you'll find out for various reasons why I am not quite as high on these cards as I was on the previous cards. And the first one of these is March of Otherworldly Light. Some might be surprised that I am including this not as a format staple, but as a possible staple, and the reason for that is because March of Otherworldly Light, unlike the card Prismatic Ending, cannot hit Planeswalkers. One, very importantly, the fact that Prismatic Ending hits Planeswalkers and this does not is extremely important, but second, the fact that this is 1 mana in addition to the cost of the permanent, as opposed to just being 1 mana and, trading on parity with it. So, like, if you want to hit a Ragavan with this, it's 2 mana instead of 1. Although it is an instant, so that's very important. But I suppose I should read what the card actually does. It is a X and white instant that can cost 2 less for every white spell you exile as you cast it. And it exiles an artifact, creature, or enchantment with mana value X or less. So, of course, many people are comparing this card to the card Prismatic Ending, which is already a Modern staple. So that by itself makes this a good candidate for being a potential staple. But I think that it's not quite up to the same power level as Prismatic Ending. That said, I'm definitely very excited to play with the card myself in my blue-white control lists, and I'm sure that I'm not the only one. Whether or not this card stands up to the test of the format will just depend on how important it is that this card is an instant, and secondly, that it can't hit Planeswalkers. If those two things tend to balance out the comparison between this card and Prismatic Ending, I would definitely expect to see this card moving forward. The second one is Touch of the Spirit Realm, a 3-mana enchantment that exiles a creature until the Touch of the Spirit Realm leaves the battlefield, but this is yet another channel card with the ability to exile an artifact or creature and return it to the battlefield at the next end step, so sort of a slow flicker effect or a flicker wisp type of effect. And the main reason I included this one on the list is because not only is this a potential removal spell, but it is also a flicker spell for those evoke creatures like Solitude and Fury. However, it is 2 mana instead of 1, which is a huge detriment, and that is the main reason why this is a possible staple and not a format staple, in my opinion. But anyways, the 3 mana O-Ring effect is already kind of slow for Modern. Like, Oblivion Ring itself doesn't see play, and it hits anything that is a non-land instead of just a creature or artifact. So, Touch of the Spirit Realm gets the nod for being a possible staple. I think that because of the channel ability, it could be playable in those decks that want to have real cards instead of just a bunch of reanimate type or one shot ephemerate type effects that don't really do anything on their own. You could just hard cast Touch of the Spirit Realm to exile a Death Shadow or whatever, which makes it potentially useful. But for 2 mana, the flicker effect may not be worth it. So we'll see in the long run how it plays out. Another possible staple that I've noted down here is Lizard Blades, the 2 mana 1/1 double strike artifact creature that can reconfigure to equip to another creature basically and give that creature double strike. The main reason I have this one on the list is for those Hammer Time strategies that might want to search up a Lizard Blades and flash it in with the Sigarda enchantment to just grant double strike. I could see that being quite powerful, and double strike is a very nice keyword, as I well know playing Amulet myself. So, that's why I've got this one on the list. The fourth possible format staple that I have seen so far from the set is Kaito Suzuki, the 3 mana legendary planeswalker that at the beginning of your end step, it will phase out if Kaito just entered the battlefield this turn. Has a plus ability to draw a card and then discard a card unless you attacked, so otherwise it's just straight up drawing a card. It's got a -2 to make an unblockable 1/1 blue ninja, and then a -7 that says whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, search your library for a blue or black creature, put it on the battlefield, and then shuffle. Again, I mainly evaluate these types of cards, planeswalkers in particular, on their plus and minus abilities and not their ultimates. So the fact that this could draw a card every turn, potentially, especially if you're attacking with creatures during the turns where you've resolved Kaito, is already quite powerful, just as a 3 mana planeswalker that just gains you an extra card every turn. Quite good. And the fact that it can make an unblockable ninja is obviously quite good when paired with the ninjutsu type creatures. However, I don't really know that there's a deck in particular that wants to play Kaito. There's not really a ninjutsu deck that I know of in Modern at this point. Maybe there will be after Kamigawa comes out, but up until this point, it doesn't really have a home exactly, so that's why I've put it as a possible staple. But obviously, powerful 3-mana Planeswalkers are what Modern is kind of about, so would be remiss not to include this one on the list. The 5th possible staple that I've identified is Containment Construct, a 2-mana 2/1 that says whenever you discard a card, you may exile that card from your graveyard. If you do, you may play that card this turn. Obviously, being able to discard things and then play them this turn instead of actually discarding them is a way to gain some extra card advantage, especially if cards are balanced by a downside of discarding cards. Being able to just cast those cards in addition to playing the card that requires you to discard them can be quite good. For example, if you uptick a Liliana of the Veil, or discard to a Bone Shards, or something like that. There are many types of cards that have seen play over the course of Modern. Lightning Axe, for example, that have discard a card as a downside, but of course Containment Construct makes that downside an upside. However, I also think that it could be possible that this card could be good in various artifact-based, like, combo-y strategies. I'm not sure that those decks typically utilize discard as an outlet for doing busted things and those, cast like Semblance Anvil type of, like, artifact nonsense. But I could see a world where Containment Construct makes those decks, makes an inclusion in those decks, or even just makes those decks better. So I put it on the list. Again, not sure if this card really has a home, but it's definitely a very powerful effect. And the fact that it's on a 2/1 body is a little weak to removal, but being weak to removal is not in and of itself a reason for this card not to be played. So, moving on to the next one, we have Reckoner Bankbuster, the 2-mana 4/4 artifact vehicle. It enters the battlefield with 3 charge counters, and you can pay 2, tap it to remove a charge counter and draw a card. And then if there are no charge counters on it, you get a 1/1 colorless pilot that can crew as if it had a power of 3 rather than as a 1/1. So you can just crew the Bankbuster each turn. And the main reason I've included this one is because some have talked about including this card in Eldrazi over the copies of, I believe it's Maze Mind Tome, where you could just play this on turn 2. On turn 3, you have Tron, or say you play a Matter Reshaper. You can immediately crew this and get in for 4 damage. And of course, it does have that 2-tap ability to just straight up draw a card, which is a nice little outlet for E-Tron to have access to. I'm not convinced that this card is better than Maze Mind Tome. In fact, I think Maze Mind Tome might be better than this card. However, the fact that it has a possible already existing deck to see play in makes me include this one as a possible staple. So we'll have to keep an eye on this one and see how it pans out for Eldrazi. And that is the last of that section. This next section I've entitled Has Potential. I think that these cards are potentially good enough. They seem powerful. Maybe they're a little bit lacking, or maybe they don't have a home, and I don't think that they have the potential to be a format staple, but they might have the potential to see play. And of those 9, the first one that I have is Lightpaws Emperor's Voice, the 2-mana 2/2 legendary. Whenever an aura enters the battlefield under your control, if you cast it, you can search for an aura with a less value or equal to the aura that you cast, and put that card onto the battlefield attached to Lightpaws, as long as it has a different name. So, this is a card that lets you double up on your auras when you cast them. You cast a 1-mana aura, and you can search for another 1-mana aura with a different name and equip it up, or enchant it up to the Lightpaws, which is extremely powerful as free card advantage, and not only card advantage, but also a tutor ability. Very, very powerful in Modern on a high-powered 2-mana 2/2 creature. Like, 2-mana 2/2 is already pretty good stats, just in general. Like, it's about what you would expect. Anything less would probably be less playable. But the fact that this is a creature that allows you to just free cast these auras into play, and not even have to pay the mana cost. You just put it on the battlefield attached. Very, very good. And I'm not sure that this is going to be a card that can make it into a deck like Boggles, considering it does not have hexproof. Bogles, perhaps you might pronounce it. But regardless, a very powerful effect. I would be surprised if we didn't see a deck playing this card at the very least. Whether or not it is a mainstay in Modern, I don't know. That depends. It is weak to removal, and that's definitely an important thing to consider. But I definitely think this has the potential, so we'll have to see where this one goes. The second one I put as has potential is a Reality Heist, the 7-mana instant that costs 1 less for each artifact you control, so affinity for artifacts, and it lets you look at the top 7 cards of your library, reveal 2 artifact cards from among them, and put them into your hand, and put the rest on the bottom. So, effectively, a dig through time for artifact decks like Wurza or whatever might be playing this many artifacts to make Reality Heist a big deal. And it is a little expensive at requiring 5 artifacts to get it to the minimum value for casting this card at 2 mana, but it is a powerful effect. Dig Through Time is a powerful effect, and I would be surprised if this card didn't see a little bit of play. The fact that it's restricted to only artifact cards, and it's a little difficult to enable to get it to lower than probably about 3 or 4 mana on average. I don't know, maybe this card will replace Thoughtcast, and maybe it won't. It depends on how easily this card is castable in those decks, but it definitely has the potential, and that's why I've got it on this particular list. Another card that I've identified as having potential is Biting Paw Ninja. It is a 3-mana 3/3 with Ninjutsu for 3, enters the battlefield with a menace counter on it, and then when it deals damage to a player, you can remove the menace counter and Thoughtseize a card out of their hand and exile it. So they reveal their hand and you choose a non-land card to exile. Obviously, Thoughtseize in itself is a defining effect for Modern. Even a one-shot discard, even on the cost of a 3-mana Ninjutsu creature, I still think that Thoughtseize is just a powerful enough effect that this card could see play, especially in decks that otherwise don't have a lot of interaction for opponents' hands. So, like, for example, this is a human, so perhaps ninjutsuing this guy in and a human's brew could be potentially useful. At 3 mana, it's a little expensive, though, which is why I've put this as has potential and not a potential staple, as it is a little costly, but I still think it's a cool effect nonetheless. Next, we have another Ninjutsu card. This is a 2-mana 2/1 that ninjutsus for 2. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you can discard a creature card to destroy a creature or planeswalker that your opponent controls. So, of course, the idea behind this is being able to trade a card from your hand for a resource impact on the board. Quite powerful. The cost of discarding a creature is unique in that this really wants you to play a really high creature density deck, which is not a problem if you're trying to play a tribal ninjas or humans deck or whatever. And being able to interact with planeswalkers or problematic creatures, again, like Death Shadow or other problematic creatures that you would want to hit with this type of effect, quite good. And Ninjutsu for 2 is not a very high cost, especially considering that you're about to trade a card in your hand to impact the board. I think that this is quite potentially a very good card. Does it have a home? I don't know. You tell me in the comments below. Moving on to number 5, we have a card that I personally find to be very interesting. Reinforced Ronin, a 1-red 2/2 with haste, and at the beginning of your instep, you return it to its owner's hand. And then it has Channel for 2 to discard it and draw a card. So essentially, you can think of this as a one-shot shock effect that as soon as your opponent has a blocker for it, you can discard it to draw a card. So in a deck like Burn, where eventually your Goblin Guide gets walled by your opponent's creatures, being able to just channel this to draw a card and hopefully spike a bolt off the top can be quite nice. However, it's not free to just keep paying 1 mana every turn to haste in this creature and then return it back. Or effectively, you could just say that it's a 1 mana dash creature, I suppose. So obviously, dash can even sometimes be an upside. If you look at a case like Ragavan, Nimble Pilferer, against all these prismatic ending decks, sometimes being able to dash in your creature and then not have it around during your opponent's turn is in fact an upside rather than a downside. But of course, paying that 1 mana every turn is not free. So for that reason, it's not clear to me that this card will actually see play in burn decks over cards like Goblin Guide or other haste creatures that they play, but is a interesting and unique effect nonetheless. And of course, it has that channel ability, and channel seems to be quite strong, so it is on the has potential list for that reason. Number 6 is Springleaf Avenger, a 5-mana 6/5 with Ninjutsu. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, return target permanent card from your graveyard to your hand. And of course, the Ninjutsu cost here is for 4 mana. So the reason I include this is because it hits very hard, especially when you ninjutsu it in, because the creature that you ninjutsu is already unblocked, so this is going to do a guaranteed 6 damage when you do ninjutsu it. And being able to recur permanent cards, not just once whenever it ninjutsus in, but anytime it does combat damage, makes this a huge threat. I think this will definitely be amazing in Standard, although I haven't played Standard, but it strikes me as a very good Standard card. But even in Modern, if you can connect with this, return a permanent, and then just have a 6/5 creature that your opponent has to deal with, that's very good. So I'm excited for this card. Is there a deck that wants to play it, especially at the steep price that Springleaf Avenger is costing you? Who knows? But it definitely is very powerful. Number 7 is Enthusiastic Mechanaut, the 2-mana 2/2 flyer that makes your artifact spells cost one less to cast, and it is an artifact itself. I mean, there's not a whole lot to say about this card. Cost reducers in general are quite powerful. If you look at the Storm decks that play Goblin Electromancer and Baral, you can see examples of what I mean. Being able to kind of, so to speak, artifact storm, quite a potentially powerful effect. And a 2/2 flyer, like I said, is relevant. The fact that it is flying means it evades a lot of the cards in Modern that are trying to block on the ground. A lot of the Modern creatures tend to be ground pounders and not in the air. So it having that evasion can be quite nice. And just the cost reducing effect is quite nice. It's an artifact creature as well, but again, can you think of a blue-red artifact deck that needs a cost reducer like this? I don't really know. Like, you could play it in Affinity, and it is an artifact itself, so definitely has some potential. I don't know exactly where it might end up, if it ends up anywhere. Another card that I thought was quite unique is Spirit Sister's Call, a 5-mana enchantment that says at the beginning of your end step, you may choose a permanent card in your graveyard. If you sacrifice a permanent that shares the same card type, you return the chosen card to the battlefield, and it gains, if it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead. So of course, you can have your random 0 or 1 mana artifact or enchantment, and then reanimate some big busted artifact or enchantment from your graveyard. And this is on end step, not on upkeep. So when you play this card, your opponent must answer the enchantment Spirit Sister's Call immediately, or you get on your end step an immediate reanimation effect. So the fact that it requires an answer now, rather than giving your opponent a 1-turn window, is extremely good. And of course, reanimation always has that effect of being unique and a very fun thing to play in Modern. So I think that people will definitely build around this card. And if it's powerful enough, especially since it does return a permanent on instep, I think that we might see this card quite a bit. At a 5-mana enchantment, it's kind of steep though. But I mean, like I said, it's a unique effect, and Enchantment Reanimator is not a huge strategy in Modern. So I think that Spirit Sister's Call is, again, one of those cards that seems fun and seems like it has potential, but might be too slow or might be a little too niche. So we'll have to see where it lands. And then we have the legendary land, the only channel land that is this low on the totem pole, so to speak. What I think is the worst channel land, the black one, that it has the channel ability of milling 3 cards and returning a creature or planeswalker from graveyard to hand. 4 mana is just a lot for this type of effect. And again, this effect is not doing anything to things on the battlefield, so you're spending mana and putting yourself behind on tempo. It does mill 3 cards, but like, I don't really see the utility of returning any specific creature or planeswalker from your graveyard to your hand by discarding a land and paying 4 mana. If you can reduce it, it's still even not that great, so I'm definitely underwhelmed by this card, and I only put it on has potential because it is one of those legendary channel lands, so it is free to play, essentially, but I don't know, I don't really expect to see a lot of this card. But if all the other channel lands are on the list, this one probably should make it somewhere, so. And speaking of playable because of channel effects, there are 4 cards in the set that I think are playable specifically and only because they have a relevant channel ability. Those cards are Sunblade Samurai, the one that has channel for 2 to search for a plains card, put it into your hand, and then gain 2 life. And of course, again, these are creatures that, or creatures or other permanents that have a high cost and a low channel cost. So this is going to be good with those Cascade decks. I don't know that there's a Cascade deck that wants to guarantee a Plains land drop on turn 3 by channeling on turn 2. But if there's a deck that wants it, this is the card for the job. Secondly, and the one I think we'll see a lot of play, Mirror Shell Crab, the 7-mana, 5/7, Ward 3 creature that channels to mana leak something for 3 mana. So counter unless they pay 3. Very powerful. Typically, in these Cascade decks, the cards that you discard simply draw a card and nothing else. So when you play your Living End deck, you're kind of just, putting stuff in your graveyard and cycling until you hit Living End, and then you cast Living End off of a, or until you hit a Cascade card, and then you cascade into Living End and just do your thing. But they're not very interactive, and these particular cards make that completely different. The dynamic has totally changed because now your Living End opponent can channel their Mirror Shell Crab to counter your combo piece, your planeswalker, your graveyard hate, or whatever, and then Living End the crab that is a 5/7 ward creature into play. And personally, I was never really a big fan of decks like Living End in the format because Living End in general, I found very boring to play against and to play with, although I can't say I've played with it a whole lot. just because you're just kind of sitting there doing your thing and hoping the living end works, and you're not really interacting. It feels like a solitaire game. That is not so anymore, considering now you have some discardable interactive spells, which I love for the format. You will absolutely see copies of Mirror Shell Crab in Modern in the future. Expect it. And speaking of, this is another card that is similar in that type of effect. It's a 4-costing creature that channels to do 2 damage to any target, and it in itself is a 2/3 reach creature that does 2 damage to any target when it enters the battlefield. I think this one is definitely weaker than the Crab, as for this type of effect, there's already the card Bone Crusher Giant, which is a castable 4/3 for 3 mana. So any deck that wants to interact like in that manner to do some damage to any target, Bone Crusher Giant is already available. So I'm not sure that Twin Shot Sniper will replace that card. It is a 2/3 reach, which is not irrelevant, but I don't know. Regardless, again, just because this card has the ability to channel for less than it actually costs, that already makes it potentially playable because of that fact. And then the final one on this category, or in this category, is Colossal Sky Turtle, the 7-mana, 6/5 flying ward 2 that can either channel to return a card from your graveyard to your hand, or can channel to bounce a creature. And again, like, think of the things you can do with this card. You can bounce your opponent's creature on turn 2 and then living in it back into play. The fact that this lets you bridge the gap and interact and still comes back from your graveyard from a living end, or you could even, for example, Summoner's Pact for this card just to have one of the 2 channel abilities, which who knows if that'll be a real thing that the decks like Amulet can do, to channel, to Summoner's Pact for one of these channel abilities specifically, but it is technically possible, and again, only because of the fact that these channel abilities exist and cost so little compared to the actual cost of the card. Finally, I just wanted to mention a particular card in the set that annoys me to no end. I think this card is horrible. I think it'll see 0 play, bulk rare, and the thing that is most annoying about it is that a few simple changes could have made this card fantastic for Modern, and that card is March of Burgeoning Life, a X and a green instant. You can, of course, pitch a green card to make it cost 2 less, and the effect of the card is to choose a target creature with a mana value less than X, search your library for a duplicate of that creature, and put it on the battlefield tapped, and then shuffle. The only positive thing I can really say about this card is that it's an instant speed card, and I guess making it cost less to cast by pitching a card is kind of interesting. Probably not worth it, but it is interesting nonetheless. The things that I hate about this card: 1, why does it have to be a mana value less than X? What's wrong with paying 1 in a green to search for a 1-mana creature? That's already an additional cost onto the cost of the card. And then secondly, it searches for a duplicate. Who in the world wants an instant speed tutor to get something that they already have in play? Like, I understand that there are cards that you might want duplicates of on the battlefield, but the thing that makes this type of card cool to me, and probably to many other Modern players, is the potential to build a toolbox around it and have a variety of things that you can search for that all have an interesting effect. But no, we just get a duplicate of your Llanowar Elf or whatever it already was on the battlefield for a cost of 3 mana, 2 mana, whatever. No, yeah, it would be 3 mana. Think about it that way. This card would cost 3 mana to duplicate your Llanowar Elf. Why it couldn't just cost exactly X and had to be less than X? I don't know. And it does have to be a duplicate, so I don't know. Like, if they had made it... Oh, and the third thing, I didn't even mention it yet, is the fact that it targets the creature. So you choose your target creature, and your opponent goes Lightning Bolt, your 1-drop that you paid 3 mana to try to copy, and they get not only the card that you're trying to copy, but the March of Burgeoning Life as well. Horrible, horrible card. Will not see play. And if they had just made it choose a creature instead of target creature, and made it cost of X instead of less than X, and especially if they had made it any creature with the same cost, it did not have to be a creature that was the same name, this card could be very good. In fact, a card that I've wanted unbanned in Modern for a long time is Green Sun's Zenith, and this would have been an instant speed counterpoint to that. Even if it was X or less at instant speed, just to search for a creature that was not the same as the one in play, and you still had to pay more than the cost of the creature for X, I still think it would be relatively playable as a instant. But regardless, what we have is this unfortunate piece of cardboard. So, and yeah, let me know what cards I missed in the comments below, because I know I will have missed them. Let me know what horrible, terrible garbage takes I've made on a card that you know for sure is going to be great from the set. and hopefully I got this out in time to entertain you guys before the set actually drops. And like I said, this is only the cards that I thought were good. If I happen to not include or talk about a card from the set, it's because I don't think that it's noteworthy, but if you think it's noteworthy, then let us know in the comments below. Hopefully you enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys in the next one. This is Red Face Menace, signing off.